This is American Manufacturing, where we discuss the how, the why, and all things manufacturing, present-day America. I'm your host, Rory Francis. And today I want to welcome back retired Colonel Chris Budihas.
Hey, sir. How are you doing? Good to see you.
It's always great to see you.
Yes, sir.
I talk to Chris all the time
yes.
about many
full
things.
Disclosure here.
Full disclosure. Full disclosure. So you got your hands, and we talk about this, you got your hands in a lot of things.
I do, yeah.
GMR, Gray Matter Resources, that's basically your consulting firm.
Yeah.
You're the chief of government relations for CF Media.
Yes, sir.
And you're doing two podcasts, Frontline Visionaries and Off the Shelf.
Yeah, sure am.
Busy. And I listened to all of those. They're really, really good.
I appreciate that.
So,
thanks for being on them.
Yeah. Thanks for having me.
Yes, sir.
We've talked about cybersecurity in the past, and most recently, the geopolitical landscape shifts every day.
Yeah.
I think things are getting a little more intense than they have been. So I kind of wanted to revisit that.
Yes, sir.
I just mentioned to you prior to the show, and one of I think really is very relevant today. A book written in 1928, Propaganda by Edward Bernays, and he posits something I don't agree with, that the general population isn't intelligent enough to govern themselves. They need an elite to do that.
Right.
That's his opinion. Like I said, I disagree. But the premise of his book, Propaganda, is how the media could actually do that, and how they could accomplish that. And I read it, during the 2016 election, and I saw that. I was reading the pages, and I've seen what was panning out.
Yeah.
Today, I think AI. You apply that AI.
Yeah.
The threat is even more so, or the potential pitfalls.
Yeah.
Elon Musk actually alluded to that, commenting when AI came out. It could be, he goes, chances are it won't, but it literally could be the death of us, so we need to protect ourselves. Your perspective, and there's a question.
Yeah, give it to me.
There's a question in here. The DoD is extremely involved in cybersecurity today, and it was kind of lost on me for obvious reasons.
Yeah.
Military perspective, protecting infrastructure and things like that. But they're involved in it for a lot of reasons today.
Yeah.
With the intensity of tariffs and geopolitics today, has there been any increase in that? Where are we at right now?
Yeah. No. Number one, thanks for allowing me to be on the show today. I think from a DoD, and I'm not a DoD expert, though I was in the DoD for 37 years, is the evolution of where we're at in cyber, and this really dialing back to what you said with Edward Bernays, this infosphere. How does this influence things? The propensity and the speed of which change is occurring both in technology and in the information environment is I'll say a wild, wild west right now. I mean, how people are influenced, how organizations are influenced are pretty, it's very dynamic, right? Both positive and negative. So to kind of unpack a lot of what you said, I mean, this is like a multi-layer onion. It's just gigantic when you overlay, the AI, what's occurring here, and the speed at which information can be changed or modified, or, the trust factor, what's being published, and is it really ground truth or not? And is it from an adversary, or is it actually from your command, or from it could be the media in general, and it has a huge impact. I mean, hell, you go in any chow hall, dining facility, on any base or post or fort. I mean, there's the news on. So how's that influencing your troops? I mean, there's a lot we need to, if we want to dive into the subject, we can take a look at. But when they talk about the instruments of national power, we talk about really three things: diplomatic, the informational, the military, and the economic, and called the DIME, if you will, because you love the military, like acronyms. But when we think of instruments of national power, the diplomatic, the economic, and the military, we think about all the time. But I'm not sure we really think about the informational piece of that, and how the adversary may be using that to gain an advantage. And it's a constant flow of information that's that's being pushed, and sometimes it's very gradual, and sometimes it's very erratic. And you can pivot very quickly. So
Well, there's publications actually support that.
Yeah.
We talked a little bit. The book Unrestricted Warfare, written by two Chinese colonels
Right.
in the CPR in 1999.
Yeah.
And they talked about really the next major war and how China, gets an upper hand is to start, gradually and iterate into media and control the media and control what became to be the internet and today AI. And they spell it out. I will imagine they do a rewrite today with AI out there. But there's a ton of historians from the Soviet Union that actually said the same thing. The demise of the United States was to get into our colleges, to influence our media, and actually grow a generation, of people that are under their influence. And Bernays, in 1928, he spells it all out there. It's an amazing book, and it's scary, So, as a nation, what is it? What can we do, or in particular, what can the DoD do?
Yeah, I mean, so much to unpack there. I mean, what can the DoD do is, one, if you think about physical infrastructure, like being computers, servers, things of that nature, how do you defend your network, and then to make sure that information there is protected, one, and then two, you keep people out of your network, through either cyber attack. That AI is just a piece of software that enables that, right? And then, how do you keep your people informed, and how do you keep your formations moving in the right direction? I mean, if I can kind of dial it back a little bit, approximately 4 years ago, the Army and even the Marine Corps doctrine has changed. I mean, before we used to talk about we're going to attack by land, by sea, and then by air. Well, 4 to 5 years ago, we decided that we're going to add 2 more domains. We're going to have the space domain and the cyber domain. So there's a actual intellectual acknowledgement that there's 2 other domains, and are all domains equal? Yes and no. In many cases, we'd all say, especially in the Army and the Marine Corps, that only people live on land. So the Navy would argue, and the Air Force would argue that the air and the maritime are more important. But the reality of it is, only people live on land, and only if you can secure land can you actually, that term, victory, be achieved. So regardless, you add 2 more domains, and there's an acknowledgement, and if I kind of like superimpose the 1999 paper, Unrestricted Warfare, on top of that, on Chinese order of battle, if you will, we're going to be attacked by cyber and by space before we're going to be attacked by air, sea, and land. That's what unrestricted warfare basically says. And we are currently, some theorists, current day theorists would tell you, we're currently under attack in the cyber and space domain daily, especially in the cyberspace. So when you take a look at our doctrine, adding 2 more domains, being space and then cyber, we have an acknowledgement that these are important areas that we need to secure and then have offensive capability, so defense, offense, in order to bend our will against or have our will against the enemy, to bend their will to achieve some form of success or security. So that's one piece of it. Also in the doctrine, you think about 1941, surprise attack, at Pearl Harbor. You think about the Incheon landing in South Korea. These are just 2 examples from, a little bit less than, 80 years ago-ish, that strategic surprise was achieved. You think about now trying to achieve that type of, an attack or invasion or surprise attack or invasion. I won't say it'd be impossible, but it'd be very difficult, especially under, current space surveillance, current cyber surveillance. There's a lot of discussion right now between China, trying to invade Taiwan by 2027, 2028, depending on what documents you read. Even the Chinese say at some point we got to be ready by 2027, 2028 in order to secure Taiwan. But when you take a look at unclassified plans that are out there for them to do that, them being the Chinese, to actually have an invasion force to attack attack Taiwan, you'd have this massing of ships and forces down in the southwest. To think that we would not see that, we being the collective world, that massing of forces, it just shows you that both in the cyber and the space domain, you would see that, and then the Taiwanese potentially would actually pre-strike those forces. So you would never allow them to get across. And I tell people, yes, Taiwan and China are very close. Definitely, Taiwan's closer to China than it is the U.S. But that 90 to 110 miles of water, stretch of water is not easy. A lot of people I hear out there, both in the civilian world, if I can use that term, and then also in the military space, talk about these false parallels between Russia and the Ukraine, and then China and Taiwan. It's, these two landlocked countries, though not a gigantic ocean per se, but definitely a large strait to go across would be very difficult. So what's my point here? In the past, 80 years ago, where you could have strategic surprise, now you could potentially not have it as a result of both space and cyber capabilities that are out there. And that's just something that we see that is changing in the evolutionary nature of technology. That has an impact on the Department of Defense. Then you throw on top of that, and I don't want to get hate mail here, but I think it was 8-9 years ago, we started a cyber command. We had acknowledgement that we needed a separate command to take over cyber capabilities, both offensive and defensive, to protect the nation. And they work obviously in conjunction with other intel organizations, whether it be the National Security, NSA, or if that's NGIA or whoever. But the fact that we have a command solely dedicated for cyber, operations is pretty amazing.
So this is a show about manufacturing. I'm going to bring it back. I'm going to use your DIME acronym, and what I'm hearing is the military needs to physically secure our assets.
Yeah.
And I believe that same thing applies to the industrial space. Companies
physically and electronically. Yeah.
Need to control our data. To do that, and we talk much. Today AI is on the tip of everyone's tongue.
Yes, sir.
But what needs to be on the tip of your tongue is the GPUs.
Yeah.
The data centers,
right? The
CPUs,
yeah.
And all the things that that actually make that possible. And that's one area. We have our, as far as innovation and actually designing those chips, we're number one. That's when we've slipped in a lot of places. That's when we actually excel. How important is it? There's an A and B in this question.
Yeah.
That we continue, to innovate and be the leader there.
Yeah.
And how much does the DoD or the government need to align with manufacturing to help them along, whether it's funding, whether it's helping with research? So A and B there, if you can.
I think we have a needs improve on all fronts here. I think, my observations of others, we take a look at, and I've talked offline before, is when you take a look at Russia-Ukraine war, almost 3 years of war, if you will, we use the latest invasion. The fact that we had to, tap in the South Korean war stocks and South Korean war stocks for 155 field artillery shells to move them to the Ukraine in order to, kind of keep the Ukraine plussed up on artillery shells, and we cannot keep pace, with domestic production of artillery shells. We had an issue with, we remember early on, the Javelin missile, which is a fire and forget anti-tank missile. Those war stocks were, I won't say totally depleted, but they were heavily depleted. And the ability Raytheon makes this missile system, the fact that we have domestically divested since the end of the Cold War a lot of these capabilities to mass produce these systems has huge strategic implications. And I think we need to, in my opinion, we need to dial it back, go back and do a backwards look in history. And this is not far history. It's not ancient history. We're talking like the last 10 years. And go, and maybe I'll take it all the way back to the end of the Cold War, so go 89, 91 time frame, and go, okay, we made purposeful decisions based on what we believe the future security needs of the U.S. was, based on a unipolar world where the U.S. was, if you will, in charge, so to speak. And we divested all these capabilities with various arsenals to build in mass types of munitions, types of vehicles, and things of that nature. Then we're in this global war on terrorism. Now we're in this back end where now our national security priorities say that we got to be prepared for large-scale combat operations with near-peer threats, specifically number one, China, number two, Russia. Well, in these cases, we look at history both with Russian and Chinese warfare. Mass is something that they heavily rely upon, and so as they, and of course their domestic capabilities, specifically with the Russians, has been significantly impacted. But with China, they have a number of issues on their own manufacturing capabilities, though they're outproducing us in many cases. Specifically, a case I would say is ships, for example. Our Navy is getting smaller, is getting much larger. Questionable on what's the quality of it. But to get back to your question, we need to do a whole look at our domestic industrial defense base and see what we need to be able to do. And I think between what's occurring now as we continue to support Russia, China, and then I would also template on top of that the pandemic. The pandemic showed us that we do not have supply chain resiliency. So there's a number of things. Now in the defense space, you have to use certain products either that are either U.S. made or are authorized by other countries to be used in U.S. munitions or capabilities. Could be vehicles, for example, or aircraft. So there's no Chinese parts per se in any of the DoD capabilities. But if we have a country, let's say a European country, provides capability to us in the U.S., and let's say that nation's either directly involved in combat and they cannot supply us anymore, or they are attacked and they surrender, then what does that mean for us? We'd have to kind of figure it out as we went along. And as a result, with two wills fighting, we may not have the time to kind of figure it out. So I think we got to take a look at that industrial base resiliency to go, where are we at and what do we need to do? And that's not just all combat vehicles. That goes to medical capability. We had this term during the global war on terrorism called the golden hour. And it was, I went to did some more research. So it was a little bit of that. I was watching Ken Burns' Vietnam series again, and they kind of talked about the golden hour also. So if you were injured on the battlefield, you would be medevac to a level 3, level 4 medical facility, so a surgical capability within an hour. Well, we're fighting in Russia, China, not Russia, China, but in the Ukraine with the Russians, that you're not going to be able to fly a helicopter up to a landing zone near the front line because they get shot down. So now you got a ground evac. So what's that capability? To include medical capability and evacuation capability of casualties. So it's, when you look at the military, a lot of people think, tanks, airplanes, ships, things of that nature. But it includes, not just the supply, but also the ability to take care of those individuals that are fighting on the battlefield, and include that medical capability. So, and all this stuff, I hate to say it, is all the Army. The Army created almost 5 years ago a command called Army Futures Command, with the idea that it was going to tap into the American innovation spirit and then the manufacturing capability. And our acquisition system for the military is, for appropriate reasons, is regulated by certain policies and laws, because over time, you needed to have those guardrails in place to make sure money was spent as appropriated and such. But we've also realized that you can't, like I think it was the F-14, the F-14 Tomcat. People remember Top Gun back in the day. That aircraft was the designs for that went back into the early 60s. But it was finally rolled out into the, in the mid 80s. So that long development timeline of idea, concept, prototype, modeling, testing to full production, we can't wait 20, 30 years to have something come off the ground. So now we got to speed that up. And then you got a thinking enemy like China and Russia. They're gonna move very quickly too. So how do you keep up that level of innovation you need, especially in your industrial base? And that, to me, that's a whole of government requirement, and then really whole of America requirement, to have conversations between industry and defense to make sure we're all meeting. And you and I, of course, give me great book recommendations. I read Ship Wars and then Mark Mills' book, Cloud Revolution. The fact that if you're not forward thinking, then you have some capability gaps that you're gonna miss, and then you're gonna we're talking defense here. You're potentially gonna lose lives as a result of not being forward leaning and forward acting. So,
well, funny, in some of the stuff I do,
Yes,
in consulting and some of the places I work, you talked about, from concept on the 14 to actual, getting in the air and flying, being 20 years. And in manufacturing today, we talk about speed, scaling with speed.
Right.
If you're not to market, Elon Musk, historically a car from concept to tires on the road, 7 years.
Yeah.
Elon Musk, I'm going to do it in 2. His first time out, he fell a little short of that, but he got really close, and he's beating that, and he's changed the market. A lot of people are employing that. I think with AI, if you're not innovating and you're not innovating with speed, you're falling behind. It's really, really important. You talked about, the military or the DOD getting involved in innovation. I know they're actively involved in STEM. How important, so, I'm going to back up here a second. When you were talking, I was thinking, about how important manufacturing is almost as a deterrent. Yeah. So I'm going to quote the Japanese admiral commander that attacked Pearl Harbor had toured the United States for years prior to the war and kind of looked at industry. And he reportedly, some people denied he said it, but he was quoted as saying something about after Pearl Harbor, I think we have woken a sleeping giant. Yeah. And the intent of the Japanese was, if we can knock out their big carriers earlier, we can, take control of the seas, and we can sue for peace, and we'll get, negotiate a peace. And his was, we got to knock them out. We got 6 months until their manufacturing might comes back at us. And,
right.
History is history. Today we're not the manufacturing leader that we were back then.
Yeah.
And we're number 2. It's not bad, and manufacturing is coming back. But how important is it to regain that leadership role, or at least to control our supply and have the ability to respond in times like that?
Well, it's funny. I was listening to the radio here, talk radio, as my kids say I'm old, so listening to talk radio on the way here, and there was this question that Brian Kilmeade from Fox News gave to one of his guests, is like, how do you decouple from China? And the answer is you don't. The question is, what do you decouple, and how do you do that from there? And then, I think DOD's gotten better. Maybe it's probably less DOD. It's a combination, just I guess America in general. This idea of dual use. There's a civilian use. There's also a military use to it. You and I have talked about various books and articles out there where, like, you think about DARPA. I mean, a lot of technology early on, like chips. We just mentioned chips earlier. I mean, a lot of that stuff was DOD oriented or DOD invested that bled over later into the civilian world. And I don't want to, because I'll get hate mail, but I will say that what I'm seeing in some cases where it's a leading indicator that this technology is being used in the civilian world, and then we're finding military uses to it. I mean, the whole drone thing. Drones have been around for a long time. I mean, some people argue World War I. Even I heard somebody say 1886 the 1860s last week, and I'd have to fact check that one. But the fact is that drones have been around for a while for military use, but the real heavy use beyond, military use became this recreational use of these quadcopter drones, and these small, drones that weigh less than 10 pounds. And now we're seeing on the battlefield where, specifically in Ukraine, where they're shooting down upwards of a couple thousand Russian drones, smaller drones per week, and vice versa right now. So I think now we need to take a look at that dual use capability, because I understand being a businessman, as you do too. Like, you got to make money. So if DoD is your only cash cow that you're going to pursue, then sometimes you're at the mercy of the Department of Defense, the down select and pick your organizations. Hence the reason why they call it the Big Five, right? Your Boeings, your Raytheons, your General Dynamics. before the end of the Cold War, we had the Big Five were still around, but there was other bigger players in that space. And now I think we need to kind of divest, push out, because some of that innovation is happening with some of these smaller, mid-sized companies. So how do you capture innovation and capability into your formation, but also make it sustainable? Because as we talked about earlier, and I was listening to a friend of mine on a podcast, Ben Conable, who was a retired Marine officer who went on and worked for RAND for a number of years. He just recently published a book. But he's right. When you look at the historical perspective of warfare, the Chinese and the Russians, even the U.S., I was reading Foreign Affairs when I was flying back over the weekend. In that article, talks about historically we are attritional based. We say we are non-attritional war-fighting nations, but the reality of it is we're very attritional by nature, and maybe that's just the nature of warfare in many cases. So if you're attritional by nature, you're going to attrit not just people, but also material. And if you're going to attrit material, you have replacements. So how do you do that as a nation? And kind of thinking back, what capabilities we need now, and you superimpose on top of that Moore's law of speed, that it's going to change so quickly. And watching, I daily watch, through articles, the Ukraine Russian fight on not just drones, but also electronic warfare, and the ability to, they put up a drone. So we had the drones were launched, the GPS, the GNSS, the most capable way of navigating, to now you can jam that GPS capability. So now they added fiber optic lines to these drones, and now they're finding that there's other ways to either cut or reduce that capability. So this evolutionary change, punch, counterpunch, counterpunch again. So.
As you're talking, I'm just coming up with more and more questions. I just could go down a rabbit hole.
Yeah.
But I'm just going to wrap. I'm going to ask you one last question. You and I talked about.
Yes.
So you talked about iteration of drones and some of the drone technology. There's just a recent article on 10 of the top companies that are actually producing product in that space for DoD.
Yeah.
Any comments?
It's interesting, right? So I've gone. I go to conferences here. Not most, but some of them are DoD oriented. So Association of the United States Army. Recently went to a couple autonomous conferences on autonomous vehicles, both aerial and ground. And there's so many people in this space. Some do it better than others. But how do you keep pace? And then who's going to invest in? So like a big company. A company that's not the Big Five, but a company you may hear, is Anduril, and Anduril's moving very quickly.
Very familiar
with Palmer Luckey and his team there. So you've got these companies that are, I won't say they were going to unseat the Big Five, but they'll definitely be able to sit at the table with them. So what do I see? I think it's good, but I'm always. So I was an infantryman, so a ground guy, carried a weapon, order troops around at different levels of command, at the enlisted level up to being a colonel. And what I will tell you is, though I believe drones are a capability that we need, and they can definitely be a combat multiplier, we can't forget that when you turn out the lights or the weather goes bad, a lot of this tech doesn't work well. So invest in the people first, and then the capabilities second. Doesn't mean that you don't, I say invest both time and effort and resources. So at the end of the day, the people on the ground are going to be your best investment, and they're going to decide whether you win or lose. Those capabilities will be important, but you need to have both flexibility in thought and then flexibility in action of the tech capability to enable them. So my thoughts are, when you turn out the lights and then the weather goes foul, this tech briefs well. But through my last 37 years in the military, I've seen it where, okay, I got all this great tech. I'm rolling around Afghanistan in my armored vehicles, striker formation, and had a lot of combat power. But that one muddy road can definitely affect you. It gets down to some of the bare basics of just being a human being operating in the environment. So I think there's Yeah, there's definitely the droneistas out there, the droneistas who are like, drones are going to do it all. I think they will do a lot, and I think we should rely on them, but I also think we need to come to a reckoning. What does that look like, and how does that look? So the Marine Corps decided they're going to have a operator within their squads that just does those drone operations, if you will. Because let's be honest, if you're operating a drone, you're not holding a weapon and pulling security, things of that nature. The Army has not made a decision yet. The Navy last year, or maybe 2 years ago, decided to make a rating, MOS.
Okay.
Of
I'm a Navy man, it's a rating.
Yeah, rating, as you know.
As a BU.
I sprechen Sie Navy, since my dad was in the Navy, so of remote operator, and then the Air Force has had remote operators too. So, when are we going to totally invest in the idea that these things are going to be around? I think we are in different ways doing that, but the stuff will be here. It's not making the panacea. This is going to. We have more drones, we're going to win, because that's not necessarily a true statement.
So we're going to wrap up. Fair to say that we're looking at measures and countermeasures.
Yes, sir.
That list of 10 was just some of it, but we're actually trying to foster innovation. And to your last point, though, we read an article yesterday about the Chinese light switch.
Yeah.
And it referred to a black swan event. That working at that master switch that basically takes down the internet or parts of it. I read it halfway through. I had to read the rest of it, but that is potential. That's black swan, and that's when it comes down to boots on the ground.
Yeah.
And in all things AI, at the end of the day, when I talk about digital transformation and AI, implementing manufacturing, the human component, we haven't found a way to remove that. I don't think we should.
You can't, right?
So at the end of the day, it's about a culture. So fostering a culture of innovation to keep ourselves, relevant and top, competitor in this market, I think is super important.
I got 2 final points, if you don't mind me.
No, please do.
So it was funny this morning. I was listening to a podcast. So I work out. I exercise my mind. I listen to podcasts. So this one podcast, Death of a CEO, he had Simon Sinek on, and they were talking about AI. And Simon Sinek, one of his points he made, he goes, I went on there and said, write something as Simon Sinek would write it. He goes, it was pretty good. He goes, I can't remember, a couple months ago. Then he recently did it again. He said it was damn good, close to how he would have wrote it. But you can't ask AI, what is the future book that Simon Sinek is going to write? Or what is Simon Sinek thinking right now? Because that's where the machine can enable some things, but it doesn't do everything. So that's one piece. One thing where I'm seeing some positive results, because I don't want to come across negative on tech, because I'm definitely a huge tech proponent. If you can, examples like breaching a minefield, if you could put machines in there and robots, put them in peril, because that's one of the most dangerous things on the battlefield, and not have to put a soldier, Marine, airman, sailor on the ground to do that, then I'm all on board. But when I was reading, over the weekend, an article with AI, we have, in the past, we called it preventive maintenance, where you would do maintenance on a vehicle or maintenance on equipment to be preventive so it wouldn't break. What we're finding with some sensors and capability, both software and hardware, that you can put on, different vehicles and other capabilities. Now you can have predictive maintenance.
Yes.
Where it's monitoring and it's going.
Now you're talking advanced manufacturing. We do that in every factory. That's what we're implementing now. So
to me, that's where industry has been moving, or has moved, where the DoD is trying to catch up. But it's an example of where now that makes sense. Where I'm seeing where AI, and then in many cases not even AI. Well, I guess it is AI with software, is enabling us to know when we're going to break, or not just predictive maintenance, but also predictive logistics. So now we know, hey, our expenditure needs to, it has been heavily degraded here, so we need to push supplies here, move these capabilities here. We talked about medical evacuation previously, so now I need to move more capacity over here because of X number of casualties or issues of the nature. So I think that's a great example where we're leveraging tech to help.
We apply all those principles in manufacturing, predictive, planning out your logistics, your purchasing, when to purchase, how to purchase, availability and alternates and all that. So that's where AI definitely most helps. That's all we're going to have time for.
Yes, sir.
We can go back and forth, forever. Chris, thanks for coming on.
Yes, sir.
It's
Thank you very
always a
much.
pleasure.
Yes, sir.
You've been watching American Manufacturing. I'm your host, Rory Comiskey. See you next time.